Hello. The day started like any other for the passengers aboard Flight 247, a commercial airliner flying from New York to Los Angeles. It was a regular flight, with families heading to visit loved ones, business travelers catching up on emails, and vacationers looking forward to a week of sun. The flight crew, experienced and steady, navigated the plane through the early morning sky, and everything seemed perfectly ordinary. Amelia Parker, a 10-year-old girl with big, curious eyes and a wild imagination, was among the passengers. She was seated next to her mother, Rachel, who had brought her along for a work trip. Amelia was a shy, quiet child, more interested in reading books about aviation than making small talk. But that morning, as they soared above the clouds, she was full of questions about the plane, the pilots, and how everything worked. She had read almost every book in the How Things Fly series, and she knew more about aviation than most kids her age. Her mother smiled indulgently as Amelia peppered her with questions about the wings, the engines, and how airplanes stayed in the sky. But what Amelia didn't know was that her knowledge of flight was about to be put to the ultimate test, under circumstances no one could have predicted. 3 hours into the flight, things took a turn for the worse. In the cockpit, Captain Paul Benson, a seasoned veteran with over 20 years of experience, and his co-pilot, Jack Smith, were conversing about their plans for the weekend. They had just finished their scheduled check-ins with air traffic control and were cruising smoothly at 30,000 feet. The cabin was calm, and the passengers were settling in for the long haul. Everything was normal. That is, until something went horribly wrong. At exactly 11:37 a.m., the entire plane shuddered as if struck by an invisible force. A momentary crackling sound echoed through the air, followed by a sharp hiss. Inside the cockpit, Captain Benson clutched his chest in sudden agony. His vision blurred, and the air around him seemed to grow thick. Beside him, co-pilot Smith was in the midst of a similar distress, his body stiffening as he fell back into his seat, unable to move. The two pilots had both collapsed simultaneously, struck by a rare but devastating medical condition known as hypoxia, caused by a sudden and sharp decrease in oxygen levels. The plane had suffered a malfunction with its pressurization system, and the pilots were quickly losing consciousness. In the cabin, passengers began to stir, alarmed by the strange vibrations and the muffled sound of panic from the cockpit. Amelia's mother, Rachel, looked around, trying to gauge what was happening, but there were no immediate signs of danger. The seatbelt sign was on, and the flight attendants were still walking the aisles, trying to calm people down. But Amelia, who had been watching the flight attendants carefully as they moved about the cabin, sensed something was wrong. She had noticed the sudden loss of control in the crew's movements, the way their faces were pale and strained. Amelia's mind raced back to the books she had read, the emergency drills she had learned about in school. She had always been fascinated by aviation and had a deep understanding of the planes she had flown on. As a child, she had even dreamed of flying one day. But this was something entirely different. She knew something had gone terribly wrong. Meanwhile, the cockpit was in chaos. Captain Benson and co-pilot Smith, still struggling to stay conscious, were unable to radio for help. The autopilot was set, but the malfunctioning pressurization system caused the cockpit to lose its functionality. The aircraft was flying blind, drifting through the sky without any input from the pilots. Back in the passenger cabin, Rachel was trying to get the attention of a flight attendant, but it was no use. The flight crew was disoriented, and the passengers were beginning to panic. Amelia's heart raced. She knew she had to act. With no thought of fear or hesitation, she stood up and walked toward the galley, her small feet clicking softly against the floor. The flight attendants had gathered near the rear of the plane, their faces drawn in fear. Amelia caught the eye of one of them, a woman named Susan, who had been trained in emergency situations. Susan was startled when she saw the young girl approaching. She bent down to Amelia's level. "Sweetie, what's wrong?" Susan asked gently, trying to reassure the frightened child. "I need to help," Amelia said, her voice firm. She didn't wait for a response. She simply walked past the startled flight attendant and made her way toward the cockpit door. Amelia had watched enough documentaries and read enough books to know where the cockpit was and what to do in an emergency. She wasn't sure if the flight crew had given up or if they were too incapacitated to help, but she knew it was now or never. She reached the door, which was usually locked for security reasons. Without hesitation, she pulled out a small plastic keycard that she had found lying on the floor earlier in the flight, one of the many things she had noticed on her journey. She inserted it into the slot with surprising precision, a skill that came from her hours of studying aviation manuals. The door clicked open, and Amelia stepped into the cockpit. Inside, the sight before her was nothing like she had ever imagined. Both pilots were slumped in their seats, pale and unconscious. The cockpit was eerily silent, save for the faint hum of the plane's engines. Amelia took a deep breath. She was scared, but she wasn't going to let fear stop her. She had one chance to save the day. Amelia stood in the doorway of the cockpit, her small frame almost hidden by the wide expanse of buttons, levers, and switches surrounding her. She stared at the two pilots slumped in their seats, unconscious, their breathing shallow and erratic. For a brief moment, panic gripped her chest, but she quickly suppressed it. She had no time to waste. She had been prepared for this. Well, not exactly this, but the thought of flying a plane wasn't as far-fetched as it might seem for someone her age. Amelia had spent years devouring books and documentaries about aviation. Her bedroom was littered with models of different aircraft, each carefully labeled and meticulously arranged. She had memorized flight controls, cockpit diagrams, and emergency procedures as though it were second nature to her. But to actually take the controls of a commercial airliner, that was something else entirely. Amelia closed the door softly behind her, her fingers trembling slightly as she took a step forward. Her eyes scanned the cockpit, settling first on the autopilot system that was still engaged. The autopilot could fly the plane in straight lines, but it wouldn't be enough to bring them to safety, especially not if something went wrong. She had to take over. She had no choice. Her first instinct was to check the pilot's pulses. Both men were alive, but barely. Captain Benson was still breathing, but his chest was rising and falling in an uneven rhythm, while co-pilot Smith's breathing was shallow, almost imperceptible. Neither of them appeared to be in any condition to help. Amelia's heart raced, but her mind remained calm. She knew she needed to act fast. The flight attendants had no idea how to land the plane. She was the only one who could, and though she was only 10 years old, Amelia understood that this was her moment, her responsibility. There would be no one else. She reached forward and gingerly touched the control yoke, the steering mechanism of the plane. It felt cold under her hand, smooth and solid. She had read about how to use it, how to control the pitch of the aircraft. She had studied it in countless hours of reading and online tutorials, but nothing could prepare her for the actual weight of it. She had seen the pilots use it with such authority, but now it was her turn. Amelia took a deep breath. She had to stay focused. Her first move was to check the altitude, which was reading steady at 30,000 feet. That was a good sign. The plane was stable for now. She quickly scanned the rest of the instruments in front of her. Speed, heading, fuel levels, all of it was within normal limits. The autopilot was still active, which meant the plane wasn't falling out of the sky. But Amelia knew that autopilot wasn't going to help her land the plane. The radio was silent. Amelia noticed that neither pilot had their headset on, and the communication channels were inactive. It was a cold, lonely silence, one that spoke of impending danger. She had to make contact with air traffic control, but how? The controls on the radio were complex, with dozens of switches and dials, most of which she had never touched in real life. Her fingers hovered over the controls, and after a moment of hesitation, she selected the radio channel for emergency communications, just as she had read about in her books. The switch flicked into place, and Amelia pressed the button to transmit her message. "This is, Flight 247, she said, her voice wavering only slightly. "This is Amelia Parker, and I need help. The pilots, they can't, they're unconscious." Her heart pounded in her chest, but she continued, trying to keep her voice steady. "I don't know what to do." The radio crackled to life, and a calm, professional voice responded. Flight 247, this is Los Angeles Center. We copy your transmission. What is your current status? Amelia's hands shook, but she clung to the headset with determination. I'm flying the plane right now. I need help landing. Please. There was a long pause on the other end. Amelia could hear the faint sound of typing, air traffic controllers consulting each other. It seemed like hours before the voice returned, but it had only been a minute or two. Amelia, listen to me carefully, the air traffic controller said. We're going to guide you through this. I need you to stay calm. First, we'll make sure you're on course. You're flying towards Los Angeles, but we need to change your heading slightly. I'm going to walk you through the process, step by step. Amelia nodded. Despite knowing they couldn't see her, she had to stay calm. She had read about this. They would guide her through it just like in the books. First, I need you to find the heading control, the air traffic controller continued, his voice calm and reassuring. It's the knob on your left, next to the autopilot system. Amelia's eyes scanned the cockpit. She found the knob and slowly twisted it, watching the heading change on the navigation display. Good, the controller said. Now I want you to adjust your altitude. Set it to 5,000 feet. You're going to descend slowly. Amelia took another deep breath, steadying herself. She made the adjustment, carefully turning the altitude dial. The descent had begun. Her mind was racing, processing each command and the information she had learned. She was flying the plane, and she was listening to instructions over the radio. It was surreal, but there was no time to doubt herself now. She had to keep going. Meanwhile, back in the passenger cabin, the flight attendants were desperately trying to manage the chaos unfolding. The passengers were aware now that something was terribly wrong. Some were crying, others were praying. One woman was frantically calling her husband, trying to reach him before the worst happened. The young mother sitting across the aisle from Amelia had her arms around her children, trying to keep them calm. It was an atmosphere of fear, uncertainty, and confusion. But amid the chaos, there was one child who had no fear, who was quietly fighting for their lives. Amelia continued to listen to the air traffic controller, following each instruction as if she had done it 1,000 times before. She knew that this was no longer just a flight. It was a test of her courage, her resolve, and her belief in what she had learned. As the plane slowly descended, Amelia's grip tightened on the control yoke. The horizon outside the cockpit window grew closer. They were nearing the city of Los Angeles, and with every passing moment, Amelia could feel the weight of the responsibility growing heavier. She wasn't just a little girl now. She was the pilot. She was the one who would either land the plane or not. There was no turning back. The minutes seemed to stretch into eternity as Amelia adjusted the plane's course. The steady descent was terrifyingly calm, but Amelia knew that in aviation, calm didn't always mean safe. Every movement, every click of the switches, every adjustment had to be perfect. The weight of the responsibility was overwhelming, yet something inside her refused to break. She had come too far, and there was no turning back now. Amelia, you're doing great. The voice of the air traffic controller, Roger Banks, crackled through her headset. I need you to adjust the throttle now. You want to maintain a steady speed as you descend. You'll want to keep it around 250 knots. Just a small twist on the throttle control. Amelia swallowed hard and reached her left hand to the throttle lever. The control felt foreign, her small fingers grasping the cold metal with uncertainty. She slowly turned it, just as she had read in her books about proper throttle management during descent. The sound of the engine slightly changed as she made the adjustment, and the plane's speed stabilized. Good, Amelia, Roger's voice was steady but filled with pride. Now you're almost in range of the airstrip. We're going to start talking you through the landing procedure. You've got this. Amelia nodded again, though no one could see her. She wasn't sure if she had this, but she wasn't going to give up. Her heart hammered in her chest. She had to focus. The cockpit felt hot, the air thick with the scent of recycled oxygen and metal. Amelia wiped her brow with the back of her hand and tried to steady her breath. She wasn't just flying a plane anymore. She was guiding it into the heart of one of the busiest airports in the world. The air traffic controller's voice broke through her concentration again, reassuring her that the world outside was still there, still fighting alongside her. Amelia, we're going to get you through this. First, let me give you the current wind conditions. You'll need to adjust your approach slightly to compensate for the wind. She readied herself for the challenge. Everything she had learned in books about flight school, every emergency training video she had watched, was suddenly flooding back into her mind. She remembered the diagrams of runways, the landings, the approach speeds, and how small adjustments in the control yoke could make all the difference. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, but her hands were steady. Outside the cockpit, the passengers were glued to their seats, each person locked in their own state of disbelief. Many had heard the initial panic over the intercom, the frantic announcement from the flight attendants telling them to stay calm. But now there was only silence. For some, it felt like the calm before the storm. Amelia's mother, Rachel, had her face pressed against the window, looking out at the endless stretch of sky. She hadn't known until moments ago that her daughter had been the one to take control of the plane. When she had first learned that the pilots were incapacitated, she thought the worst. But then, the reality of Amelia's actions began to settle in. Her daughter was flying the plane. She could hardly believe it, but she knew her daughter was something special. Amelia had always been curious, clever, and determined. Maybe she had always known more than anyone gave her credit for. Rachel's mind raced with thoughts of what might happen. She was terrified, yes, but there was also an overwhelming sense of pride. Her daughter was doing something that no one, no adult, no trained pilot, had been able to do. Amelia was keeping them all alive. Back in the cockpit, the plane was now entering the final stages of its descent. Amelia was following Roger's instructions to the letter, though her nerves were starting to get the best of her. The runway was in sight now, but it felt impossibly far away. Her small hands gripped the control yoke tighter as the distance between the plane and the earth quickly closed. The air traffic controller's calm voice kept her grounded, offering instructions like lifelines. Amelia, you need to slow the plane down now. Gear down. Flaps to 30 degrees. You're going to start your approach in just a few moments. Amelia's mind raced to keep up with the flurry of instructions. She had read about this, but in books it was all so clean, so simple. In real life it was messy, fast, and relentless. There was no time for second-guessing. She had to act, and act quickly. Her fingers danced across the controls, adjusting the throttle, lowering the landing gear, extending the flaps. She had watched the pilots do it countless times, but now it was her turn. It felt like a dream, but she couldn't afford to let herself get lost in it. Flaps set, she murmured to herself, mimicking the pilots she had watched on television. Gear down. A moment later, a soft ping rang out in the cockpit, signaling that the landing gear was fully deployed. Amelia's grip tightened around the yoke again, and she focused on the horizon. The runway was coming closer, closer still. You're doing great, Amelia, Roger said again, his voice warm with encouragement. The runway is now in your line of sight. Begin your final approach. Keep the nose level, maintain your speed, and prepare to flare as you get closer to the ground. Amelia nodded, though her mouth was dry. She knew this moment, this final stage, would be the most critical. Landing wasn't just about getting the plane down safely. It was about precision, timing, and control. She could feel her stomach tighten, but there was no room for fear. She adjusted her position in the seat, mentally checking every control, every setting. Her focus was sharp, every instinct telling her what to do. She could see the runway ahead now, stretching out beneath her like a ribbon of safety. It was wide, it was long, and it was waiting for her. She took a deep breath, held it, and slowly began to descend. The ground rushed up to meet her, and Amelia gently pulled back on the yoke to flare, lifting the nose of the aircraft. Her palms were slick with sweat, but she knew this was the moment. The moment when everything could go wrong or everything could go right. And then, with a soft thud, the wheels of the plane touched the runway. The entire aircraft shuddered as it made contact with the ground, but Amelia held her course, slowly releasing the throttle. The plane bounced slightly before settling into the perfect glide as the brakes engaged. The roar of the engines dimmed, and the plane coasted down the runway, slowing to a halt. The cabin was silent, the passengers holding their breath as the plane came to a complete stop. No one moved. No one spoke. They were waiting, all of them, for the plane to either crash or land safely. And then, a cheer erupted. It started with a few passengers in the front, and then the sound spread like wildfire. Applause filled the cabin. Some passengers were crying, overcome with emotion. Others simply sat there in stunned silence, unable to believe what had just happened. Amelia Parker, a 10-year-old girl, had just landed a commercial airliner. She had saved their lives. The moment the plane came to a halt on the runway, it felt as though the world held its breath. The engines wound down, and the hum of the plane's systems slowly diminished. Amelia sat there for a heartbeat longer than necessary, her fingers still lightly gripping the control yoke as if her body couldn't quite believe the miracle it had just performed. Her chest rose and fell rapidly as the adrenaline surged through her veins. She had done it. She had landed the plane. But before she could fully comprehend the magnitude of her accomplishment, the cockpit door burst open. Amelia! Oh my God! Amelia! It was Rachel, her mother, standing in the doorway, her face pale but filled with an uncontainable mixture of awe and terror. Behind her, flight attendants, paramedics, and airport staff crowded in. All eyes locked on the girl who had just taken control of a Boeing 737 like a seasoned pilot. Amelia blinked and took a deep breath, feeling the weight of her body after hours of tense concentration. The realization began to set in. She was safe. They were all safe. She had done it. Her mother rushed to her side, wrapping her arms around her daughter, but Amelia barely noticed. She was still processing what had just happened. Amelia? How did you do it? Rachel stammered, holding her daughter tighter, as if afraid to let go. I just remembered everything I read about, Amelia said, her voice soft and distant. She was still trying to make sense of it all, as if someone else had flown the plane. But when she looked around and saw the faces of the paramedics, the flight attendants, and the astonished passengers peeking through the open door, she realized that it was her. It was Amelia Parker who had just saved their lives. Outside the cockpit, the terminal had already begun its frantic buzz of activity. Emergency vehicles were racing down the runway toward the plane, lights flashing and sirens wailing. The paramedics had been on high alert, given the strange reports from the cockpit. They had expected a crisis, but nothing had prepared them for the shock of a young girl stepping off the plane as the hero of the hour. Inside the cabin, passengers were still processing the landing. Many of them were in shock, some still wiping tears from their eyes, others staring blankly ahead as if they couldn't quite understand what had happened. They had witnessed the most improbable thing. An ordinary, frightened 10-year-old girl had flown them across the skies and landed a commercial airliner safely on the ground. One of the flight attendants, Susan, who had seen the whole ordeal unfold, was in the aisle, helping people to their feet. "It's over, folks. It's over," she said, her voice shaky with emotion. "We're on the ground now. We're safe. You can all breathe." But as the passengers filed off the plane, some stopped to look at Amelia, curious, in awe, and some even in disbelief. How had this little girl done what no adult had been able to do? A few minutes later, Amelia stood in the jetway, now surrounded by airport officials and reporters. Her mother, Rachel, was still at her side, holding her hand tightly. Neither of them could fully grasp the enormity of the situation, but the press was already beginning to swarm around them. The questions were relentless, the cameras flashing in her face as reporters shoved microphones in front of her. "Amelia, can you tell us how you did it?" one reporter asked, pushing forward through the crowd. "Was it instinct? Did you get any training?" another shouted. Amelia blinked, overwhelmed by the attention. She hadn't expected any of this. Her life had just gone from ordinary to extraordinary in a matter of hours. She had no answers for them. All she could do was shrug and say, I just remembered," but that answer wasn't enough for the world. The story exploded in the media within minutes. A young girl saves 150 passengers. A child hero flies a plane. The headlines were everywhere, and within hours, Amelia was a household name. The press dubbed her the girl who landed the plane, and news outlets scrambled for interviews. The world couldn't get enough of this impossible story. Meanwhile, the airport officials were in a whirlwind of their own. The flight crew was immediately attended to by medical professionals. Captain Benson and co-pilot Smith had been administered oxygen and were recovering, but the extent of their condition wasn't immediately clear. The malfunction in the plane's pressurization system had caused a rare but dangerous medical condition, one that had taken both pilots out of commission. Fortunately, both were expected to recover fully, though their medical emergency had, quite literally, left them powerless. Amelia's actions were now being scrutinized from every angle. How had she known what to do? Why had no one been able to help her before? The answers were simple, in a way. Amelia had learned everything from books, from documentaries, and from hours of studying aviation. But no one could explain how a 10-year-old girl had managed to take control of a massive commercial airliner and land it without a single crash or injury. And yet, as the media frenzy reached its peak, Amelia found herself unable to really enjoy the attention. Despite the pride she felt for saving so many lives, there was a quiet emptiness in her heart. She had never wanted to be a hero. She had never wanted the spotlight. All she had wanted was to help, to do the right thing. Now the world was watching her, and she wasn't sure what to do with that. The next few days were a blur. Amelia and her mother were placed under security detail for their protection, though the authorities were careful not to reveal their location. The media hounded them at every turn, trying to get exclusive interviews. But Amelia wasn't interested in the fame. She didn't care about the cameras or the applause. All she wanted was to go home. But things weren't that simple. The airline, the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and even the government wanted to meet with her. They had questions, too. They were all curious about how a child with no formal training had managed to do the impossible. And amid all this, there were people questioning whether Amelia should be allowed to fly at all. She had saved lives, but what kind of precedent was this? Could a child just walk into the cockpit and take control of a plane? Would it encourage others to try it? In the following weeks, there were hearings and discussions. Experts in aviation, medicine, and psychology weighed in, trying to make sense of how one young girl had defied all odds and become the face of the most remarkable act of heroism the world had seen in years. But for Amelia, the questions and interviews felt like a distant dream. All she wanted was to go back to being a normal kid, one who loved books about airplanes, not one who had to answer questions about how she saved hundreds of lives. One evening, as she sat alone in her room, staring at a framed picture of the plane she had flown, Amelia smiled softly to herself. It was strange. She had no real memory of the exact moment when she took control of the plane. The fear, the stress, the overwhelming nature of it all had faded, replaced by something else. Pride. A quiet sense of pride in what she had done. Amelia had become the hero that no one had expected. And for now, that was enough. The months following Amelia's extraordinary act of bravery passed in a blur. The media storm eventually subsided, but the story of the 10-year-old girl who had flown a plane continued to circulate, each retelling more dramatic than the last. The world had moved on to the next viral sensation, but Amelia remained at the center of a whirlwind of attention. Her life, once simple and quiet, was anything but that now. The airplane company offered her a scholarship to an aviation academy, an honor that made headlines. Even the government sent her a letter, commending her for her courage and offering a reward for her quick thinking under pressure. But for Amelia, it all felt like a strange dream, one she hadn't asked for. She appreciated the support and the accolades, but it wasn't what she had wanted. She hadn't flown the plane for the fame or the rewards. She had done it to save lives. She had done it because it was the right thing to do. Still, the attention was inescapable. Amelia's schoolwork, once a source of pride, now seemed secondary to her new role as a symbol of courage and survival. Her classmates treated her like a hero, but sometimes, Amelia wished she could just be a normal kid again. Someone who could sit quietly in class without everyone staring at her or asking for an autograph. Her mother, Rachel, had tried her best to shield Amelia from the media circus, but it was impossible. Amelia's face was everywhere, on billboards, in magazines, even on talk shows. It wasn't just the aviation world that had recognized her. It was the entire world. But as the months wore on, Amelia began to realize that the true weight of what she had done had only just begun to settle in. One day, as Amelia sat on her bed, flipping through the pages of an aviation book she had read a dozen times before, her phone buzzed. It was an unfamiliar number. She hesitated, glancing at the screen before answering. "Hello." Amelia's voice was small but steady. "Amelia Parker?" A deep voice responded. "This is David Lorne. I'm with the FAA. I'm sure you remember the investigation following your flight." Amelia's heart skipped a beat. It had been months since the official inquiries had taken place. The investigations were mostly about protocol, about how the flight crew had been incapacitated and why no one had acted sooner. But Amelia hadn't expected anyone to contact her directly after all this time. "Yes, I remember," Amelia said, her voice cautious. "Well, we've been following up on your story and, there's something we think you should know. You're aware of the reward offered to you by the government, right?" Amelia nodded, though the mention of the reward didn't bring her any excitement. It had been a small token of appreciation, something she hadn't asked for, and she hadn't even thought about it much since. "It's not just a token, Amelia," David continued, his voice growing more serious. "We've done some calculations. The airlines, the aviation experts, and the government, well, they've been working together to figure out how to acknowledge the magnitude of what you did. You've saved over 150 lives, Amelia. And after reviewing the incident, we believe you deserve something more than just a plaque." Amelia felt her pulse quicken. What was he talking about? More than a plaque? "What do you mean?" she asked, trying to steady her breath. "Amelia, we believe you've earned an official seat in a flight academy. A fully sponsored program with everything paid for. It's a one-of-a-kind opportunity. We've been working with several high-end flight schools. We want you to have the chance to do more than just read about flying planes. We want to help you make it your future." Amelia's heart raced. This was a dream come true, wasn't it? The very thing she had secretly longed for since she was a child. The chance to fly, to understand the intricacies of aviation firsthand, to become part of something bigger than herself. But the idea of it felt strange, almost overwhelming. Was this the life she really wanted? "Thank you," she said softly, feeling the weight of the decision on her shoulders. "But I don't know if I'm ready for all of that." David's voice softened. "I understand. But you've shown the world what you're capable of, Amelia. You've demonstrated something few people, no one could have done. And that deserves recognition. Think about it. You don't have to decide right now." Amelia stood by the window, staring out at the horizon. The sky, wide, endless, and beautiful, had always been a symbol of something greater to her. When she was younger, she had spent hours looking at planes in the sky, imagining herself up there, flying among the clouds. But now that the chance was within reach, she wasn't sure if it was the right path. It was the opportunity of a lifetime, but was it what she truly wanted? The weeks that followed were filled with phone calls, meetings, and media appearances. But as the noise of the world outside grew louder, Amelia found herself retreating inward. She needed time to think. She needed to step away from the spotlight and remember what had driven her to act in the first place. The desire to help. Not the fame, not the rewards, but the simple need to make sure that everyone was okay, that everyone was safe. Her mother, Rachel, was understanding, always there to listen, but she could see the weight on her daughter's shoulders. Amelia had saved lives, yes, but she was still just a child, struggling with the enormity of it all. Rachel encouraged her to take a break from the world, to step out of the media frenzy for a while, and to spend time just being herself again. It wasn't about making decisions now, it was about finding peace. So one weekend, Rachel took Amelia to the beach. It was a quiet, peaceful spot, a far cry from the chaos of the city or the media circus they had been living in for months. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the sand, Amelia sat beside her mother, her feet buried in the cool sand, her thoughts finally drifting. "Do you remember when I first took you up in that little plane when you were 8? Rachel asked, a wistful smile tugging at her lips. Amelia nodded, the memory vivid in her mind. She had loved it then, the feeling of flying over the fields, seeing the world from up above. It was a sense of freedom that she had never forgotten. You loved the sky back then, Rachel continued. You always said you wanted to be a pilot. Amelia's lips curved into a small, bittersweet smile. I still do, Mom. But I don't want it to be because I have to. I want to make sure it's something I truly want. Rachel nodded, squeezing her daughter's hand. Whatever you decide, sweetheart, I'll be proud of you. Just remember that you're still just a kid, and you have the whole world ahead of you. You don't have to choose today. Take your time. As the weeks passed, Amelia began to understand something crucial. She didn't have to follow a path laid out for her by anyone else. The fame, the rewards, the pressure, they were all temporary. What mattered was what she wanted to do with her life. Not because of what others expected, but because of what made her happy. And for the first time since the flight, Amelia felt like she could breathe. The weight had lifted from her shoulders. Whatever she chose to do with her life, she knew she had already accomplished something extraordinary. She had saved lives, and that would always be enough.